Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, November 1st, 2019. Confusion. Perhaps that's the main reason candidates oppose the fair tax. Every 4 years, we are told by the candidates for president that they're going to provide all kinds of benefits to every possible group. This year, some, but not nearly all of the promised benefits are Medicare for all, which will eliminate the need for private insurance and will be delivered at no or minimal cost to all Americans. Forgiveness of student loan debt. Free health care for all illegal aliens in the U.S. Free college tuition. Increased Social Security benefits, and a guaranteed annual income. Now, of course, when these candidates are asked how they plan to pay for all these benefits, they wave their hands and say, "Oh, we're going to make the rich pay for it." Now, some of the candidates, when pushed, will admit that some part of the proposed benefits may have to be paid for by increasing the size of the national debt, but then they quickly add, "That's not a problem." Obviously, they don't want the recipients of these benefits to think it will cost them anything. Now, most Americans have learned that it is very important to monitor their disposable income. Now, that's not what they make, but what they have left over after deducting federal, state, and local taxes. Once they've determined their disposable income, then they know what they can spend. And if they don't voluntarily keep from spending more than they have, society has a way of enforcing basic economic rules. They find their credit is no longer available. They start getting calls from collection agencies, and they may even lose their home, car, or other assets. The American people have been promised free benefits before that they either ended up paying for with higher taxes, or they watched as the politicians just increased the national debt. Many Americans are skeptical about the promises the candidates are making to them, but they really can't evaluate how the costs of these benefits might affect them. They want to believe in a free lunch, and even though most Americans are uneasy about the spiraling national debt, they accept the assurances of the ruling class that the size of the debt is not important. The problem is that with the income tax model, it is so confusing that most of us just shake our heads and admit that we really don't know if the rich will pay for it all or not. So, how much will these programs actually cost, and who is really going to pay for them? In a study written by David Burton for the Heritage Foundation entitled "It is Arithmetically Impossible to Fund the Progressive Agenda by Taxing the Rich," the projected costs of the proposed programs and the funding sources are examined. Government data, not opinion, is used in this carefully researched study. David points out that the cost of the proposed programs will be between $105 trillion and $150 trillion over the next 10 years. Imposing a 100% tax on the earnings of all incomes over $1 million per year would bring in only $986 billion. Now, that's not enough to pay for even the projected $1.1 trillion annual deficit for 2019, much less cover the cost of any new programs. Confiscating all remaining after-tax income of those with incomes of $500,000 or more would increase federal revenues by about $1.4 trillion annually. Now, this would be enough to eliminate the federal deficit, but not much more. If, however, the federal government were to confiscate all remaining after-tax incomes of those earning $200,000 or more, that would increase federal revenues by $2.7 trillion annually. Now, only $463 billion of after-tax retained earnings by corporations would be available for confiscation if that rate were 100%. Now, once such confiscatory taxes are imposed, these taxpayers would elect not to work, otherwise earn income, or realize any capital gains upon reaching the relevant thresholds because they would get to keep none of what they earned. Once state and local income and payroll taxes were taken into account, earning additional income would actually cost these taxpayers money, since the total effective tax rate on incomes over the threshold would exceed 100%. And even if the people continued to work when all of their income was being confiscated, these taxes would only fund between 37 and 72% of the costs of the proposed new programs. Well, what if the fair tax was the law of the land now? The people making these promises to us are intelligent people. They actually believe that we will look at all the presents they're offering us and then trust them to find the money to fund them in a way that doesn't make us pay more or harm anyone. Politicians know that none of us really understand the income tax and how it works. In fact, they count on us not understanding it to make us believe that somehow they are going to convert tin into gold with just a few clever adjustments to the tax code. Now, under the fair tax, all of us would be paying a percentage of our retail purchases of new goods and services, and it wouldn't take any Einstein-type calculations to figure it out. Simple fifth-grade math would do it. For example, if each percent of the fair tax is going to bring, for simplicity, let's say $200 billion into the U.S. Treasury, and the proposed new spending level is $1 trillion, you divide the $1 trillion by $200 billion. The result is that you would need to add 5% to the 23% fair tax rate to pay for a new $1 trillion worth of spending. Now, assuming that we insisted that new spending be currently paid for, on the day after the fair tax rate increase, all of us would see the additional tax on every retail purchase of new goods and services. Now, the only way to change this would be to add that $1 trillion to the national debt. Then, if the interest on the trillion was only 3%, this would mean that an additional $33 billion would need to be rated. And this would only increase the 23% rate by $33 billion divided by $200 billion. Now, this calculation assumes that we never have to repay the debt and that we can keep getting gullible people to finance our debt. In conclusion, we elect people who will represent us, and they are supposed to carry out our wishes. Now, we all wish for health, happiness, and freedom from crime and huge medical bills. We want our children to have an opportunity to get an education and then a good job. We want our children and grandchildren to see that their lives are actually better than ours. Politicians want us to be like the driver going down the street listening to music when he hears a strange knocking sound coming from the engine. That driver has two choices. One is that he can look up an auto repair shop and have the problem diagnosed. The other is that he simply turns up the volume of the music until he can't hear the knock. The driver knows that that's really not the best thing to do, but some part of him thinks that if he doesn't hear the knocking, it will not be a problem, at least not for now. But before long, though, the driver will go to start his car and find that it won't run because the knocking led to a total breakdown of the engine. He only delayed the time when a small problem would become a huge problem and maybe even a catastrophe. Now, if our decision is to be like the guy who turns up the volume on the radio, then why even have elections? Just appoint people to office for life, and these people will determine what's best for us. Now, that's much more honest than electing people and not really understanding our federal tax system when we need such an understanding to accurately determine if they're doing a good job and should or should not be reelected. If we really want to take responsibility for the mess that our politicians have created, we should start by lifting the veil of confusion around how we raise money to fund the federal government. If you raise money through the fair tax, there is no confusion at all about how much government is costing us. If someone says they want to forgive student loan debt and it will require all of us to pay an additional 3% of fair tax for 4 years, maybe we will accept that rate because the majority of us agree. At least everyone will understand it. Now, isn't it time that the rest of us said to the ruling class, we demand the facts about raising money to fund programs? The only way to do that is to pass the fair tax, the only fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.